Now recording.
Hello and welcome to the Roundtable Podcast. I am Shogun. Today we're having a very special debate about authoritarianism versus democracy. My debate partner tonight will be Knight of the Roundtable Surprise, my old friend, and he will be championing democracy while I represent my own personal understanding of benevolent authoritarianism. After 3 5-minute debate rounds of 5 minutes each, we will begin an open discussion period where everyone can speak freely. There will be two polls, one showing which debater you feel did a better job and which opinion you agreed with more, being the other poll. And that'll take place at the end, followed by the open discussion. So that being said, thank you, Surprise, for joining me again. And how you doing today?
Very well, very well. I hope the same for you.
Absolutely, thank you. So again, I apologize in advance if there's any further connection problems, but God willing, there won't be. So that being said, we're going to get started. Merlin, whenever you're ready, you just, I gotta fucking stop kicking that beer bottle. Just let me know when you're ready to, and I'll begin the first round.
All right, I'm ready to go. Your time begins when you begin.
Okay, so as I've said many times to some of you before, my personal philosophy is actually articulated as consensual, benevolent, meritocratic, authoritarian hierarchy, but that's obviously much too long-winded. So I actually owe our member Captain Reality for telling me that he thought of it as pragmatic benevolence, which works just as well as benevolent pragmatism. So benevolence means that which is well-intentioned, good meaning, or kindly. I interpret benevolence to be the positive side of a moral axis, the positive side of that axis, of course, being good, this being a vertical axis, the negative side of this vertical axis of good and evil being what I call, or what is called, malevolence. So evil is, spitefulness, malice, cruelty, and sadism, and good is benevolence, which is compassion, good intention towards others. Essentially, to be benevolent is to take happiness in the happiness of others and pain and feel pain for the pain of others. That means to be good, whereas to be evil or sadistic is the opposite of compassion, and it means to take pleasure in the pain of others and pain in the pleasure of others. So this is what determines good versus evil, and obviously if you're evil, you're not going to create a very good government. And given that this debate is over which is the ideal social or political system, obviously you at least have to have a very strong intention to create the best possible social system. So what is the purpose of benevolent pragmatism? It is to achieve utopia. What is utopia? U is a prefix meaning good, and topia meaning society. Utopia then means good society, whereas a bad society is a dystopia. Now, it was pointed out to me that there's some other meaning of utopia, meaning no place, but that is not really the correct meaning of the word in common usage, and I'm using it to mean a good society. People sometimes think utopianism is a quote-unquote pipe dream, or that this is something, not to be pursued. But to say that you wouldn't pursue a good society is contrary to the whole purpose of social policy, social engineering, and social, society, right? If you have a society anyway, you might as well have a good society. And if you're not even going to aspire to that, well, that's silly. So I think we take it as we want a good society. How do we get it? We need a good government. What is a good government? Well, obviously, a good government must be two things. It must be benevolent, meaning it must have the people's best interests at heart, genuinely, not even just the people, but nature and so forth as well. It must also obviously be competent. What is competence? Qualified, educated, trained, carefully selected through screening, background checks, psychological assessments, selected from a very young age, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is they would be the most qualified people, would have the most power, qualified in a holistic sense that would encompass both the meritocratic dimension of intelligence or competence, which is an amoral, not immoral, not moral, it's just an amoral dimension, right? Being intelligent doesn't make you morally good. However, it is good to be intelligent, right? It is a good thing to be intelligent, but being intelligent doesn't make you morally good. So the leaders of this society would have to be two things, right? Highly competent, intelligent, and educated, and also extremely benevolent. So my meritocracy is both the rule by the brightest and the rule by the morally best. Optimus Prime means the first is the best, or the best is the first. Remember the Autobots? The best one was the leader. He was Optimus Prime. The Autobots would have been much less effective if anyone other than Optimus Prime was the leader. His name encompasses his idea, right? The Optimus is the prime, the first is the best. This is how males and females as well should function right in society, in the sense that we look at, a lion pride or many other examples where there's, sort of a patriarchal or matriarchal figure that plays a positive role in guiding that social group and so forth. We see this in elephants, we see it in lions, we see it in many different things, right? And the leader can be either male or female, right? I don't have a preference to gender. Whoever is the most competent, regardless of race, class, sexuality, or any other such factor, at least in principle, would be eligible for the position based on competence. I feel like I'm coming to the end of my round. I know I didn't get much headway. There's a lot more to say. Nevertheless, sorry? Thank you. Okay, so basically what I want to, so that's the meritocratic dimension, right? You have to choose the most competent, the most qualified, and the most benevolent. If they're either malevolent or incompetent, then your government's not going to work out. If they're both benevolent and competent, well, obviously that is going to work out. So I find it kind of amusing how people sometimes argue against meritocracy for all these different reasons. But when you get right down to it, it's the rule by the best qualified. And we all know that's better than the rule by the less qualified. How could it be otherwise? Now, to get into my whole system, if I can in a minute, right? So benevolence is the first, like it goes in order of importance. So the most important thing is benevolence. That comes number one before anything else. Two is consent. So benevolence comes first, then consent. What does this mean? It means you can never constrain anybody's consent unless it is unquestionably benevolent and necessary to do so. We can think of many examples of this. So freedom is inherently a desirable thing until it transgresses benevolence.
And that's time.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's round one for Shogun. Surprise. Are you ready? Surprise. Are you there, my friend?
Kind of whiskeyed out, bro. Surprise.
I guess you blew him away with your first argument.
No, sorry. No,
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
No, it's all good.
My unmute button would not fucking work at all. But yes, I am ready.
Okay. Your time begins when you do.
First, I would like to say that I agree. Utopia technically means no place, via the Scottish philosopher Sir Thomas More. But we all know what we mean when we say utopia, so there's no need to be pedantic about that. I mean, we all want a utopia. If you want to be more pedantic, if you want to be more precise, you say eudaimonia, which is Greek for the good life. But my sort of, just as Shogun has a certain vision of it, totalitarianism or authoritarianism rather, I have a certain vision of democracy, which says that the consent of the governed is paramount, and not just in the terms of, well, we decided this, do you like it, yes or no, but in the terms of, no, from, to use an old saying, from soup to nuts, the people get to decide what laws under which they are governed. Now, where I differ is I don't believe in direct democracy, where you hold a referendum for everything, and I don't believe in a individualistic liberal democracy. I think it's incumbent upon leaders to craft movements. It's not an individual exercise, because the average individual, they're a plumber, they're a doctor, they're a preacher, they're a salesman. They don't, to modify Lenin's quote, the masses are asses, but that's okay because they've got a whole bunch of life going on. Can't expect them to know every law, can't expect them to know every issue. So it's incumbent upon leaders to craft a movement to which people can actually join, something that is simplistic, but not necessarily wrong. I mean, if they don't agree with me, obviously I'm going to think they're wrong, but you have a democratic force to where people come together. It's not like we have in the United States, where you kind of have a cafeteria view to voting, where, well, this person agrees with me on this, and no, fuck that. You sign up to a program, like Ronald Reagan said, if you agree with me on 80% of the issues that I hold, positions that I hold, I ask you to vote. I ask for your vote, and it should be the same thing. So democracy is not wrong. It's just a matter of how do you apply it. If you apply it via direct democracy, if you apply it via, do you want this amendment or do you want this law, yes or no? And if 51% say no, then that's it. Then of course not. But if you have a representative democracy, if you have a democracy where people sign up to a certain program like we used to have and we no longer do, which is part of the breakdown of our system, then there's no issue with it because that holds with both the ability of elites to make decisions as they see fit. So it's it's not direct. They don't owe you the pandering, they owe you their judgment, to paraphrase the quote. But also the people have a direct say. It's not like and the problem I have with because we're not so far apart, but I have to create contrast. The problem that I have with Shogun system is that you get an elite technocracy where, yeah, the people that were originally chosen might have been great, might have been competent, might have been men of vision, women of vision, but as that goes down, there's no mechanism to improve that.
1 minute.
You got 1 minute. Okay, thank you. You got to have an elite, and this is the problem with the Soviet Union. It's the problem with all the Eastern European countries that fell. You got to have an elite that is capable of justifying their power and not just capable of inheriting. And I think democracy, when done right, is the best way to do that. You've got to have feedback from the populace. Not in all things, but in general, absolutely. You've got to have votes. You've got to have representatives, and those representatives have to be accountable. Yield
Thank you. Whenever you're ready, Merlin, just go. You can just direct me to start.
Yes.
I shouldn't speak until you do.
My bad. Sorry. My puppy distracted me. Let me get that alarm. Yes, your time begins whenever you're ready. This will begin round 2. So go ahead and begin whenever you would like.
Okay, so thank you. Well said, Surprise. So I do need to quickly finish articulating my own position, and then I will turn over to countering my opponent's position. So I'm going to do this as quickly as possible. I will repeat myself somewhat. So pragmatic benevolence is well-intentioned, meritocratic, meaning rule of the best. Authoritarian, meaning those who are qualified to wield power would not really have very many constraints on their wielding of that power, right? Because by definition, they have the authority, because they have the responsibility, because they have the capability, right? So capability, right? You've heard in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Therefore, with great responsibility must come great power. And for both the responsible and the powerful, there is enormous, sorry, I'm surprised. Could you close your mic, please? It just threw me off a little bit. There's some mic spam. If I could ask for a restart on the time, I would appreciate that, actually, because little things like that kind of throw the thought.
Sure. That was only 1 minute in, exactly, actually. So we'll go ahead and restart the time.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not going to restart the time, no.
It's too late. I already stopped the clock. So
okay, just stop me a minute early, please. I apologize.
Okay. You go ahead whenever you were ready.
Okay. So again, in my system, I'll tell you exactly how this would work and why it would work the way it would, okay? So essentially, the management of human society is the gravest and most difficult challenge faced by human beings, because literally every other human problem is a subset of our overall problem of functioning as a society, right? Everything from environment to economy to military to defense to health. This is insanely complicated, right? So obviously you have to be an extraordinary kind of person to be very good at this job, right? And you're also going to have to very specialized education and training to be adequate for this task. And without pointing a finger at any orange-colored people, we've all seen examples of people who are not in some ways or another optimal leaders, right? And I'm not anti-Trump. I'm not going to go down that road right now. But the point is, right, the leaders we currently have are not optimal, and many of our problems result from the fact that we elect people to power who are objectively not the best candidates available. So we need a system of screening and selection, and the process of screening and selection would actually, in my system, and this is where it becomes somewhat science fiction sounding, but actually none of this is even remotely outside of our current possibility. It's just a matter of political will. It has nothing to do with technology. All the technology exists. So in my system, right, and again, there's many complicated ethical problems here, obviously, which I'm happy to discuss after the debate. But in my system, you would ideally use a program that I won't describe by the usual term, but would involve actually optimizing the health and fitness of people through certain kinds of educated breeding and even certain kind of treatments, et cetera, in the womb, right? So that these babies ideally would actually be enhanced even before birth. But that's not essential to the process, and obviously it raises enormous ethical problems. But the point is, once they're born, and again, not all of them would have to be born into the program. It would depend on whether or not that was effective or not. But most of them also would be taken through just screening all the education systems, all the schools from the earliest age, right? So in my ideal system, you would be literally testing an infant's grasp reflex, right? So if you put your finger in an infant's hand, some infants will grasp a little earlier than others. Boom, they're in the program. So you're identifying who tracks objects, who responds to their mother's voice, the earliest possible signs. And health, genetic health, mental health, the most optimal candidates are put into the most elaborate system of education and training ever devised, right? So what I call this is the F-35 human program. And the F-35 is the most expensive weapons platform ever developed, with a price tag of about $1.5 trillion and several billion or $100 billion per plane. I'm not sure exactly what it is. Insanely expensive. Why? Because it's such a powerful weapons system. But actually the most powerful weapons system, as well as system for peace, is actually the human mind. So if we're going to invest this much money into weapons like planes, we should invest this much money into the people who run our society. Then there would be a never-ending process of competition, assessment, and testing.
1 minute.
Am I done? 1 minute. Okay, so essentially, these children would all live together in a certain government facility, which would be completely designed from top to bottom to optimize the information richness, social richness, et cetera, of their environment. And they would be going through a special curriculum that would be created by a holistic panel of experts from every conceivable relevant field, including logic, ethics, natural science, social science, psychological science, ethics, morality, you name it, everything, right? And it would be a multi-billion or trillion-dollar curriculum to develop. And then either the same team or panel of experts or a different related panel of experts would then be put in a position of continuous 24/7 supervision of these children at all times, and administering and assessing the results of the tests. The slightest sign of malevolence, incompetence, mental health problems, et cetera, would generally be disqualifying. And there would be never-ending testing and competition to sort people based on both capability and interest. And at the end,
that's time.
Thank you.
Surprise. Round 2 for you begins whenever you're ready.
Well, my opponent had to yield a minute due to my own actions. So if I may, if he has a 45 or 40-second point that he'd like to make, I'm happy to yield that just so we all have equal time. I don't think that'll fuck us up too bad.
It's up to Shogun.
I appreciate that, but I actually didn't lose a minute, really. It's fine. Thank you. I'll make it up and we can continue after. So thank you.
Okay, perfect. Just to kind of counter, or just as a countervalence to what my interlocutor has said, first off, the basic incoherence of the average citizen can be changed by movements. It can be changed by programs. It can be changed by, here's what we believe. People have done this from the communists all the way to the Nazis and everybody in between. So you don't need, the search for the perfect voter is kind of a black swan or a Bigfoot. It's something that can't be found. I mean, it's not something it's not a legitimate search to begin with. What you do is you find a movement, you find a message, and this is something that we lack because we're in the Clinton-esque triangulation period where you try to meet the voters where they're at. Well, if you meet the voters where they're at, then of course it's going to be nonsense. Of course it's going to be ineffective. You've got to say, this is what I believe. This is what I want. This is how I'm going to do it. Will you vote for me? Yes or no? So a part of that is, an indictment on leadership, but it's not an indictment on democracy necessarily. I mean, if you put sugar in your gas tank, you're doing it wrong. The car will not perform correctly, but you still fucked it up. So that also goes. I had a second point about complication, but that kind of goes with it in terms of the average person's ability to deduce and divine complex factors. Democracy can accommodate that if the leaders, if the representatives are willing to take that on. Secondly, I would say education is not talent, and feedback is needed. So you can be the smartest person in the world, but if you believe and if you've been educated, as the United States elite has, in a lot of ways, I mean, they're not all idiots, especially at the lower levels. But if you believe in a failed system and you're trying to apply your brains to how that works, then it really doesn't matter if you've been genetically engineered to be smart, if you are a graduate of Harvard like Larry Summers was. Larry Summers being from Harvard does not make our response to the disaster of 2007 to 2009 valid. So, just from real world examples, you can say, well, if we genetically enhance them, that wouldn't happen, but you're not selecting for the kind of things that you cannot test. Therefore, based on people that have tested well, I'm skeptical as to whether, because it's all subjective. I have very strong views on politics, but I still recognize that it's all my opinion. What's right is my opinion. What works is more objective, but that's more from looking back rather than looking forward. You can say this benefits Wall Street, this benefits most people, this benefits whites, this, whatever. But it's all subjective and it's all about what you're aiming to do. And genetic enhancement, be it your brain or your body, is not going to tell you that. So feedback is needed. You got to have people saying, "Oh, this is bullshit," and you can reject that or accept that, but you still need that feedback. And finally, I would just say I'd make a comment on the variability of genetics. I guess with genetic engineering, that's kind of mitigated, but how many people in the shtetls were there before Einstein came about? How many sons of Lutheran pastors came
1
along
minute.
and made, thank you. How many sons of Lutheran pastors came about and made great scientific discoveries in Germany, for instance? So it's not so much that it's kind of like awarding the Patriots a Super Bowl, a Lombardi Trophy every year because they won it in 2010 and they get it every year till 2020. Genetics are not enough. You still have to have a system which injects new blood, and democracy done right is the only way to do that. I mean, it's the optimal way to do that, in my opinion. I yield my time.
All right. Well, thank you, Sir Prize. That ends round 2. Shogun, round 3 will begin when you do, and so will your time.
Thank you very much. So I have so much more I want to explain about my system, but this wouldn't be a debate if I didn't, oppose my opponent's argument. So I'm going to spend this round solely attacking democracy and explaining why democracy is a terrible system on its face. In practice and in theory, it's objectively a horrible idea. And I'll explain why, but I don't want to disrespect my opponent. He's totally coherent, and I understand why people like the idea of democracy, remembering, of course, that democracy means rule by the people, and of course that we don't actually have one right now, but you can listen to my debate with Dex about that. But so the reason democracy is a terrible idea is because democracy is the rule by the majority, right? Whoever gets the most votes is the majority, and they pass the decision. The reason this is an objectively terrible idea is because everything falls in a standard distribution, including human beings. And the center of a standard distribution is always the average, the mean, whatever, the median, the middle. Therefore, democracy is literally mediocrity. It is literally the rule of the average. However, there is no conceivable system of leadership that would be decided by a rule of the average. Obviously, in any form of decision making, from medical to mathematical to logical to anything, you don't want the average, you want the exceptionally good. You want the extreme outliers on the positive end. So when you get cancer, you don't ask all your friends what's wrong with you, right? You immediately go to a doctor. And if that surgeon or doctor tells you you have X disease and 100 of your friends tell you you have Y disease, I think we all know we trust the competent, qualified, capable, educated person and not the majority, right? And you can think of so many examples of this. When I explain what democracy is eating cookies for dinner every day because there's 3 children and 1 parent, right? What do you guys want for dinner? Cookies, cookies, cookies. Father says, I think chicken and vegetables would be a good choice. 3 votes to 1. I guess we're having cookies again. And is this a hyperbolic example? Absolutely not. The obesity rate in America is what, 50, 60%? Diabetes rate through the roof. People don't even know how to eat. They don't even know how to feed their children. And so if we give them this thing that is so fetishized by American called freedom, well, that includes what? The freedom to give your child a 2-liter big gulp every day until they get obese and die? Is that freedom? Or is that stupidity? Should the government step in and tell people that they can't feed their children Fruit Loops every morning? Absolutely yes. That's called benevolent authoritarianism, right? It's totally good intentioned. We're not trying to hurt you. We're not trying to control you. We're not trying to boss you around for no reason. This isn't some fetish about jackboots and fucking fashion uniforms. It's not a racist thing. It's about realizing that whoever knows the most and has the best intentions has the moral responsibility for everybody else. With great power comes great responsibility. So I'll give you a few examples of why freedom can be bad. Here's an example. Your child is chasing a butterfly. She's about to run across the street. She doesn't care that she might get hit by a car. You can see she's in great danger of being hit by a car. You have every right and an absolute responsibility to run over, physically pick her up, right? She may go, no, no, put me down. That would be her consent. So she's denying you consent. However, because you're older, right, and more intelligent and more developed, you know that you know better. So her consent is no longer relevant. But when your daughter is just playing happily, chasing a butterfly in the yard, obviously you're never going to put your hands on her, you're never going to stop her. So the use of force is always the minimum necessary and never less. So as soon as the force is this much, the one who has the authority to use it uses that much force. Obviously, the best of all possible systems is a benevolent, powerful government. The worst of all possible systems being a malevolent, powerful government. Now, again, you're better off taking the opinions of the extreme outliers, the educated, the qualified, than just general uneducated masses, right? I mean, maybe there's some climate change skeptics in here, but I'm not one. I'm actually trained in environmental science on a planetary level, basically. And I can tell you that climate change is an existential threat. However, there's a huge number of completely unqualified and fairly unintelligent, in some cases, people who literally don't even know or understand what it is, how it works, or that it's real. So a very possible scenario is where all the
1
voters
minute.
just don't give a shit. Thank you. That all the voters in America just don't give a shit about climate change, and they all keep voting, yeah, more oil or more gas or whatever. Don't do anything about climate change, and then literally the human race goes extinct because of democracy. Whereas one environmental scientist, like frankly myself, in some ways, I'm not actually a scientist, but social scientists who study global ecological issues, you would be better off taking my opinion than basically anybody else's, because I actually studied it and I actually know how it works and what's going on. And the same would apply to anything, right? So that's why democracy just doesn't make sense. So in my system, you would have, and you're right, absolutely right, Surprise. Genetics is not everything, but all other things being equal, genetics is significant. Everything is significant, right? This is a system of taking people who are outliers in every conceivable way, pitting them against each other and themselves in a never-ending process of education, training, testing, surveillance, competition, and repeat, right? Now, if I have time, and I probably don't,
And that's time.
No, thank you.
Okay, that ends Shogun's third round. Surprise, your third round begins when you do.
Okay, first of all, I would say democracy is not necessarily average, and the average is not necessarily effective upon the outcome. I mean, the average American did not like blacks in the 60s, to pick an example. But, that doesn't negate the need for feedback. Again, we're not so far apart because I do believe in leaders doing things that aren't necessarily popular at the time, but that's entirely different from abandoning the entire principle of the people have to be along with you most of the time when you decide a law that's going to affect most of the people. Otherwise, you become the czars of Russia or the Kaiser, or just pick any detained or deposed monarch or monarchical regime. You can look at the tyrants of ancient Greece, be that in Greece itself or southern Italy, Magna Graecia. So it's not just a matter of average versus the elites, because people can figure it out. I mean, if they're given enough information, people figure it out. It's not the elitism, elite intelligence. You have dipshits at the top, you have dipshits at the bottom, you have brilliant people at the bottom, you have brilliant people at the top. It's not, and even if you try to genetically control for that, that's never going to change. Um, Second thing I would say is because he brought up, Shogun brought up, McDonald's. Well, it's not as simplistic as food, which by any event has not been voted on. So that's kind of a poor example. I would say we should stick to laws that we disagree on. I don't say that in a malicious way, but I'm just saying, how to raise your kid, what to feed your kid. That's nothing that's been voted upon. That does show the essential ignorance of the masses, but then that goes back to what I was saying, where that doesn't matter if the masses are coalesced into movements as opposed to just monads, individuals left to their own devices, and candidate X says something I like, and candidate Y says something I like, candidate Z says something I like, and I'm just going to try to average them all out. Of course not, because they're busy with their lives. They're busy making the country run. Not everyone's a politician. We're not Athens. We're not a city of 30,000 people. No one in this chat is, whether you're Canada or the United States, it doesn't matter. Dick waving over, population size. The point is, none of us are in direct democracy territory, and that's not really what's being argued here. The point is, you do have to have feedback, and the people who are affected by the laws should have a say in those laws. It's not just, well, Tommy has superior genes than you, therefore this disastrous tax policy should go through. The second thing is, I would say politics is not medical. I would go back to my point. Obviously, you would trust a doctor, but when it comes to politics, it's all subjective. Even a psychopath like me who follows this every day and has strong opinions, I admit it's all subjective. It's an art, not a science. The leading of a nation is mostly an art, not a science. It's not totally unscientific. I don't want to go that far, but it is not something as simple as, well, if a doctor has a recommendation on cancer, you go to the doctor. Well, if a politician has a recommendation on foreign policy, you can pick 3 or 4 different ways that'll work out okay. They're not going to destroy your nation, but it's all about what you prefer. What is your position?
1 minute.
Thank you. Someone who went to Yale will agree with you, and someone who went to Yale will disagree with you. So it's not quite that simple. And secondly, I would say uneducated does not necessarily mean understanding. This kind of goes back to the whole point that people are not politicians. They're busy with their lives, but they know what sucks. They know what doesn't. And if you don't, certain things that suck have to be suffered, obviously, especially in America where everyone's hyper individualist. But just because they haven't gone to the right schools, they don't have the right parent, they don't have the right genes, doesn't mean they don't know when a policy is bad for them. Yeah, I'll end there. Let's get to Q&A. I yield my time.
All right. Thank you very much. That ends round 3. I would like to do closing thoughts, 2 minutes each. I think this will give our audience time to check out our 2 straw polls that are posted in the events channel or the recorded event channel. There are 2. One for who do you believe won the debate, and one for what do you think is the best type of government. So if you have closing thoughts, gentlemen, you have 2 minutes, beginning with Shogun.
Thank you very much, Merlin. Thank you very much, Sir Prize. Very well done. Really appreciate it. I'm going to try and use this time efficiently. I want to be clear that my system isn't just like a genetic or superiority system, and also it's simply about making sure that the people who occupy any position of power and authority are of the highest possible moral, intellectual character. So that is the core of it. Now, I do want to explain one thing. My system is also explicitly designed to minimize corruption, because there's essentially three ways that governments fail. One is malevolence, two is corruption, and three is incompetence. So my system does this by eliminating the two primary sources of corruption, which are nepotism and greed. And it does this by ensuring that the children who are raised within the program are selected for the program. And again, you guys are going to probably think I'm a monster, but I swear in the preceding time, I'll be able to explain these ideas better. They'll never know their family, and they'll never know their children if they have any. And the reason for this is because we've seen again and again through history that a great emperor creates a great empire and then passes it to his son.
1 minute.
This has happened over and over. So this needs to be prevented. So these children would be what I call an administrative caste, and they'd actually be slave kings. So this is a disturbing concept, but I promise you it checks out ethically in my mind, which I guess doesn't mean much to you. But the point is those with the greatest power are not the most privileged. On the contrary, they would be forfeiting a last name. They would never have a last name. They would also never have any bank accounts, personal property, or personal incomes of any kind. And they'd be under 24/7 surveillance and have no privacy of any kind. So this would literally make corruption impossible. You cannot be bribed. Your family cannot be threatened, kidnapped, or tortured. Your romantic relationships, etc., cannot be used against you. And you cannot be incentivized to hand off your power to your children. You'll never know who they are. And if you ever do anything shady, you're literally being watched 24/7 by a panel of experts who are assessing everything you do your entire life. Why is this extreme sacrifice necessary? Because these children will bear an incredible burden. And the greatest threat of my system is the corruption of such dangerously brilliant people with so much power.
And that's
so this
time.
must be reduced to zero. Thank you very much.
Very well said.
System, but that just shows you've thought about it, because that's what's necessary for that to work. And more extreme things have been thought. I would just say, with respect to democracy, it is a good system when done right, when it's de-individualized, when people understand it's not about your personal preferences, it's about joining a movement. And it's good for the people that lead it. It's good to have the feedback. It's good to have the legitimacy of a majority. And it's good to have the culture that we have now, decreasingly so, unfortunately, on both sides, not just one or the other, where if you lose, you understand, okay, well, I've got the next time. I've got 2 years, 4 years, I've got 6 years for my senator. Or, wherever you're at, if you're in England, 5 years, whatever the case may be. So I think you need that feedback. I think you need the people. I don't think you leave the people to their own devices, but I do think you need the legitimacy and feedback that comes with the type of democracy that I'm talking about. It's one that's very corporative, very not individualistic, but it does take into account
1
the
minute.
views of the majority. And I'll yield my time. I'm anxious for Q&A on that.
Okay. Well, that is our closing thoughts. I would like to implore our audience to check out our straw polls. We'll be checking out right now. Now I would like to open it up the floor to the audience to go ahead and put in their 2 cents on this topic. If not, then continue the conversation, gentlemen.
Yeah, if nobody has questions or comments, I'd actually wish we'd done a 5-round debate. I'd be more than happy to keep going back with Sir Prize. But that being said, back and forth, if anybody does have a question, a comment, or wants to chime in on the topic, provided you heard the event, then please do so now.
Yeah, I kind of been waiting to go ahead.
Paulie, Party, I specifically said if you heard the event to exclude you, so you're muted, but go ahead.
I had a question for Prize. Given the limitations of people, aren't you going to hit like a maximum achievable quality of government with democracy? Right? it's never going to reach the potential utopia that Shogun's describing. On the other hand, maybe that's not achievable.
Well, I don't think utopia is achievable. I'm not playing word games with Shogun. Well, it's no place. It's like, well, we all know what he means by utopia. But even under the current description, I don't think that's possible. But the whole point is, it's not about the quality of the people per se. It's the quality of what they're being sold. It's not the quality of the customer. It's the quality of the product. And when it comes to politics, especially in a two-party system like we're in, people are going to buy what they're sold. So, I mean, there is a lot of responsibility. This is why we're not totally opposite, because it is at the end of the day, whether you believe in democracy or not, it's all about the leaders. And there is an incumbent responsibility upon the leaders. And really, when it comes to that, when it comes to representative democracy, you have representatives to represent you, of course. It's not, it doesn't really matter if it's 30,000, a billion like in India, which is not a good case at the moment, but there are reasons for that. So, I don't foresee any max out of it, given my principles of what a movement democracy is supposed to entail. And perhaps I should elaborate on that, but I'll do that on other questions.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, we could open it up to 2 more bonus rounds.
Well, I think we can do the rest of the debate in an informal manner, but I'm just saying I have a lot more that I couldn't cram into that 3 rounds. So if I could take a turn then, one more time if anyone else had a question or a comment. All right, so with that being the case, I just want to specify 2 things. Or were you keying up, Omega?
Yeah, I'd like to say a few things. For me, myself, I'm an authoritarian, and I see it thusly. I've got a choice between 2 tyrannies: a tyranny of meritocracy or a tyranny of the mob. And I trust the meritocracy over the mob, because the mob's is restricted to the bell curve, with a majority being 100 IQ, and it's neither dumb or smart. And so we do end up with an average society and average outcomes, and that's not going to impress everybody. It's not going to be a utopia.
I mean,
but I can also see the downsides of geniuses, a tyranny of geniuses, where a genius may make a decision that cuts out the rot. All right? They get pissed off with trying to fix everything, and they instead cut out the lower IQs. All right.
Thank you, Omega. I thought that was extremely profound. Sorry, can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
If I could take the next turn, please, that would be awesome, because I wanted to respond to all the shit that's been said so far. I just wanted to say I thought Omega's insight that you have 2 tyrannies, the tyranny of meritocracy or the tyranny of the mob, that is brilliant. If you don't mind, I'm going to use that a lot, because that's 100% right. We're going to have a government either way. All I'm saying is we should have an optimized government of highly qualified, highly intelligent, highly moral people who are specifically raised to be immune to corruption. If I'm correct about my thinking, you'd then have smarter people who are more moral and less corrupt, which would obviously make better administrators. And, I wanted to take the opportunity to clarify 3 quick points. Just because you have a meritocracy, it's actually not a political system in and of itself. It's the way that we create the political system, right? So whether you think I'm intelligent or not is up to you, am not of the kind of person who would likely make it into this program. I would probably not even get close, right? So I actually can't tell you what these people I'm envisioning would decide to do. So the reality is that my meritocratic system I'm describing could end up being democracy. The problem is I need to see these children go through this whole lifetime of training, education, competition, testing, surveillance, repeat, until they tell me how society should be run, because they're smarter than me, right? So the point is simply that the society will be devised by the people of that intelligence, et cetera. But the point is, it doesn't exclude democracy or voting. I personally think those are bad systems. But again, it's also conditional. So this server, and I'm sorry if I go over my time, I'll be quick as I can, is actually both a social experiment itself, in the sense that, not in a malicious sense, but in the sense it's an experiment in how best to run the community for benevolent ends, right? And it's also a way for me to see. And I wanted to point out that when this system server was created, it wasn't created as an authoritarian, a meritocratic hierarchy. It was actually created as an anarcho-communist, syndicalist model of complete equality, complete freedom, complete voluntarism. And there was originally only one mod rank, and everyone was equal. And each new rank was created out of a recognition that those who work harder, care more, are more benevolent, contribute more time, both deserve and need more power and responsibility. And I'm really sorry. I just want to say there's two parts of my meritocracy. One is actually only for the administration caste, but society as a whole would also be meritocratic. So Prize was saying, well, you know, education isn't everything. Absolutely right. I don't believe that educated people are necessarily smarter at all. And to that extreme, that in my system, any person could walk in off the street to any job or any government office and take a series of tests and assessments, and whether they had no education, whether they're 5 years old or 95 years old, you know, they would be able to take a top job just by being the best at it at any time, with or without education. But the people who are in the program, obviously, you're going to educate the fuck out of them, because they're going to have jobs. At the end of them, they're going to be sorted, right? Administrator of health, whoever is most interested into that. Administrator of war, whoever is most into that. Defense, I mean, infrastructure, et cetera. So I'm just saying you could have voting in this system, but it wouldn't be ever a general vote. It would be a vote among qualified experts. So on climate change, we take a vote of climate scientists, right? On infrastructure, we take a vote of engineers. And I won't take any more time. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great, I mean, no need to apologize. You did exactly, because I was just butting in to say we should both tackle that, and you first. But I would remind people that the mob is so-called is not necessarily incompetent. I mean, there is an incoherence to the mob, and that's why I believe in a controlled and representative democracy as opposed to a direct one, or, you know, whatever the fucking communists are advocating. But if, you know, people know what the effect of laws has on them, and if you want legitimacy, you can't just be like, well, you know, I know your point's not entirely genetic, it's not entirely educational, but entirely genetic and not entirely educational is what my country, the United States, is currently dealing with. You know, meritocracy is not, just as the mob is not necessarily incoherent, the meritocracy is not necessarily coherent. You know, you have experts that are trained, to put it crudely, the wrong way. And it's like, what do you do with that? If there's not a feedback loop, if there's not like, hey, this isn't, first off, it all runs into my first point about subjectivity. But even objectively, you know, this is something that if you can only point to people, well, you know, living standards are rising in Hubei or Wuhan or Tianjin or Nigeria, that doesn't cut it with people. I mean, people are, you know, people are stupid, but they're not idiots. You got to have that feedback loop. You got to have that legitimacy aspect to it, wherein you can only get that from democracy. You can't get it from a closed elite that maybe starts off well. You know, so and so is a great war minister or a great defense secretary, you know, whatever your country says. But then later it becomes nepotistic. I mean, it's kind of the same issue I have with total libertarians. It's like, well, yeah, but if you take away the impediments to monopoly, you're going to have a monopoly, whether you like it or not, whether that's true capitalism or not. It's the same way with government. If you have this issue where there's only these people and these have been deemed the chosen. All the results are out, the jury's in, the judgment's in, the ruling's in, whatever you want to, however you want to put it. You're going to have a situation like we have now where competent men and women do this, and it's assumed to be correct because that's the way it's always been done. And you have people that can't think themselves out of a situation that's actually disastrous for the country. It's like I'll finish with this. Like, people are concerned about populism. The best quote I've heard on it: populism is an illiberal democratic solution to undemocratic liberalism. Now, Shogun's not a liberal, either in the American sense or in the real sense, but that's what you're going to get. And then after that, when that conflict comes, it's like, do you create 1984 or not? Do you respond to the will of the people, or do you just close down in a surveillance state and say, well, you're going to like it whether you like it or not? And I think democracy is a pressure valve that keeps you from those situations.
If I can build off, sorry, Hank, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I think that if people were educated a little better, and not in the sense of academia, but in natural law or God's law, and everybody governed themselves, there would be less need for large government, whether it's democracy or republic or whatever. So I'm a libertarian. So I think that if I govern myself, I don't need to be governed, right? Very, very few creatures actually need to be governed. Look at how ants work. Nobody's governing them. They just do their job and produce their own fruit and everything. And I think that it would be a lot better for us to go back to that. The old ways worked. I mean, I know that I say all the time that I'm a libertarian. Libertarianism works. The only problem is that people have started to get away from natural law. And when you break natural law, there's going to be consequences. You start killing people in the streets, people are going to rise up. But if we could just go back to governing ourselves and sustaining ourselves, and so much chaos would just be avoided, like completely avoided, if we could just follow natural law.
Thank you so much, Hank. Very well said. I completely agree with you. Sorry, can you hear me, Price? I really want to reply because you spoke and then he spoke. No, Sir Price, every time you speak, you should let me speak at least once before you speak again. So you had a turn, then he did. What?
No, this isn't argumentative. I just want to say what you say. Address his point, and then I'll address it. I think we both should tackle that.
Yeah, no, I have the mic. You don't need to tell me what to say, for God's sakes. When I have, just don't fight for the mic, please. Just be quiet. Please, just let me talk. You got a turn. I listened. He had a turn. Now I would like another turn before you speak again, because that's called the order of the mic, right? You shouldn't take the mic twice before it's gone around 3 times. That's one of our basic voice chat rules. And since we're doing an open chat, it's ideal, because the point is, you made a point that I wanted to respond to before I forget it, and so did he. So just allow me to do that. Thank you, and I apologize. So all I wanted to say is, you made a point that democracy is a great pressure valve, and you also made a great point that you need consent of the governed. And as I mentioned, the server gives many great kind of object lessons in this. And I know some of you, like Snarl and others, were here when I nominated Merlin for promotion. And someone demanded a vote, and I said, well, no, I'm not giving you a vote, because it's an executive decision. It's not a democracy. And that was my authoritarian perspective, right? I just thought I knew what was best for the server, and I thought this was it, so I was going to do it, and I wasn't going to put it to a vote. But then Merlin stepped in and said, no, I don't want the position unless I have consent of the governed. And he insisted on a vote, and because I was promoting him above myself, then obviously if he wants the vote, even if I disagree, well, he's making that decision now because he's above me in this hierarchy. So therefore the vote did happen, and then retrospectively I realized how wise that was, because when it was a majority for him, very strong, it prevents disagreements and hostility down the line. So I just want to say you're absolutely right, Sir Prize, and that is why, as you know, although this is an authoritarian hierarchy, the server does allow and have regular votes, but we do those votes in a nested sequence. So there's votes at different levels. There's sometimes whole server votes, like that one. There's sometimes night votes. There's sometimes night around table votes. So you could describe it as a nested democracy, right? Or like a Christmas tree structure of ever smaller round tables stacked one atop the other, et cetera. Now, the second point I really wanted to respond to before I forget was Hank's, because Hank said that natural law is, if people followed it, then there would be no need for government. That's absolutely right. So I was speaking to one of my mods earlier, And, I said in a perfect world, the best system would be anarchy, meaning even just extreme libertarianism, radical freedom. That would be the optimal system in a perfect world. However, in the real world, that's the worst of all possible systems. But we can create that world. So in other words, the amount of control and government of people will decrease as their competence, capability, and compliance with natural law increases. And if you're already in compliance with natural law, you will never experience interaction with the government in any way other than when they provide you with goods and services, et cetera, and employment. So no one who is good will feel any power. Those who are evil will have a gun to the back of their head as quickly as possible. That's all there is to it. So nobody who doesn't need enforcement will be enforced. Those who do not comply with basic morality, though, will need a government to bring them in line. And the last point I wanted to respond to, you said, look, ants don't need government. Yeah, that's correct. And it would be nice if humans were like that, but humans have organ trafficking, sex trafficking, cartels, torture, sadism, murder, rape, child abuse, and so we need a government.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. My interruption was not a fucking speech; it was a point of order.
No, it was a violation of a point of order in that it's fighting for the mic, and it should have just immediately stopped as soon as it became apparent that two people were speaking. And you should have immediately yield the mic. Even now, you're interrupting, actually, technically.
No, well, you interrupted me, but I get that it's fine. But it wasn't to steal the mic; it was just to offer suggestion for the further conversation.
I know, but listen, dude, this isn't a big deal. But please let me clarify it, because this is a basic understanding. No, just read the rules, right? So it literally, do not take the mic until it's circulated 3 times. Well, exactly, but you're now questioning the rules during a recorded event when this is our basic #1 understood thing. So I'm now going to explain it to you, unfortunately. So never speak when someone else is speaking, ever. Do not fight for the mic, ever. If 2 people are speaking, yield the mic. And do not take the mic more than once every 3 turns. This is called our core voice chat rule. So I listen to you, have a full turn without interrupting or fighting for the mic. Then I listen to Hank, have a full turn without interrupting and fighting for the mic. So quite legitimately, in the order of the mic, I should have been next to speak before you, because don't take the mic more than once every 3 turns. So the mic can circulate instead of going back and forth, and so that I can have a chance to respond to your points and his. So I know that you wanted to contribute something. The problem is, so did I. I already knew what I wanted to say, and it was my turn to say it. And we shouldn't have had to fight for the mic for that long. This whole podcast has been about that's the meritocratic hierarchy. And as you know, I'm above you in that hierarchy. Therefore, fighting for the mic was unstrategic and counterproductive for everybody. If you hadn't done that, there would have been much less disruption in the room, which is why those rules are so explicit. And sometimes they are to keep track of, but you are expected to.
I realize that, but I mean, my point is literally you should speak more on something. There shouldn't be a conflict about that. But to Hank's point, we've tried your way. We've tried the natural law way. We've tried, just let everybody do what they want. The point is that natural law is subjective. I mean, no one knows what that means. You ask 50 different people, you're going to get 48 to 50 different versions of natural law. So you need the government. And also, you're not an island unto yourself. You live in a society, you work at a job. You live, if you're like me, you have an HOA. Like me, you have a police force, or in my case, a sheriff's department. So it's not as simple as just I govern myself, because then the question becomes, governed by what rules? And that's going to vary from person to person. It's not evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident, but then they outline the truths. They didn't end there. So those truths are self-evident, sure, I guess. I mean, to Americans, many of us, but it's not as simple as just, well, natural law, therefore, because your natural law is not the same as my natural law, is not the same as Shogun's natural law, it's not the same as Omega's natural law. So that's not the helter-skelter shit is not how you run a society.
Yeah, I apologize for that disruption. It was, not a big deal at all. But that being said, if we can return back to the topic, I think it's been a great debate. I think we both got into this quite a bit. I guess if there is another point I wanted to respond to that Sir Prize made, he said, we should get feedback. We should be getting input from the governed in how things are going. And I totally agree, right? My system would not in any way be unconcerned with the feelings of the people. That's its fundamental explicit purpose, right? So the whole point of this benevolent utopia is to elevate the conditions of life of all people. And this is the point I didn't really get to that I meant to with Hank, was that the point of this government would be to elevate all other people to the level of these people, right? So how do you do it? It's the concept of the tip of the spear, the vanguard, right? So in order to make all people comply with natural law, you have to give them leaders that will teach them, explain to them, model for them, and create the conditions for natural law to become more common instead of less common. And then, as that process proceeds, the interventions of government become more and more subtle, right? And Lao Tzu, to give him credit, said, "You should govern a country as you cook a small fish, very gently." I don't follow that rule at all, but Lao Tzu is a much wiser person than me, so I thought I should point that out. So the point is, you never want to use excessive force. You always want to use the bare minimum force to achieve the necessary goal, and you would never enforce or infringe on anybody who hadn't done anything wrong or who was already doing things right. So I used the example earlier of the food, and Sir Prize correctly said that, we don't vote on food, but my point was more to do with the general concepts of freedom, and because democracy entails certain concepts that are elevated in America, such as freedom, freedom of speech, inequality, and democracy. And we'll do another podcast later, just going over why all four of those things can easily become negative, right, or go too far. So the point is, if you were to try and tell people, hey, the government has the right to tell you what you can feed your kids, and even to take products like Fruit Loops off the shelf, that wouldn't happen in a democracy like America, right? Because the people would just say, no, we don't support that policy. They'd vote against it. But that policy actually needs to happen, right? It's actually child abuse to feed your kids so much sugar they become obese and get diabetes, and yet this is a routine practice in America. And the problem with democracy, actually, I'll tell you exactly what the fundamental problem with democracy is, or even freedom, or more specifically libertarianism, like what Hank said, not democracy, but freedom, is there's no such thing as freedom anyway. It's an illusion, and it's a harmful illusion when enshrined into law. And an example would be, people would say, what's more fundamental to my freedom than my right to feed my kids what I want to? These are my kids, it's my house, leave me alone, right? Don't infringe on me. And you'd be right, except that it's actually child abuse, and the child is not actually getting a choice in that situation. So the child's freedom is already being infringed by the parent, right? So I've literally had people tell me that because of libertarianism or whatever, they should be allowed to manufacture meth. That's not true, because if you manufacture meth, you produce toxic waste, you create fires and explosions. And obviously nobody here is endorsing that, right? But I'm just saying that everything you do affects society as a whole, and your family and your children and future generations and nature. So your freedom is everybody else's problem if you're doing anything bad. If you're not, no need to interfere.
I mean, funnily, we agree on that point, and you're right to, and I'll retract my food statement because that is true. It was a general point, it wasn't a response to anything I said, and that is true. But that goes into the managed democracy that I talk about in terms of movements, leaders, programs, parties, what have you. It's not a democracy as it exists is not an optimal system. Direct democracy is not an optimal system. The past version of what we did, both here in England and Canada, I assume Canada, much more optimal, where it's a democracy that's not as democratized, if that makes any sense at all, where the leaders have some leeway to do what they feel like they need to do. But yeah, I mean, we mostly agree on the freedom point. We're both not libertarian, funnily enough, but I still think democracy is the best way to carry that out.
Hey, I had a question for Shogun, if I could have the mic for a second.
Absolutely. Also,
yeah,
just before you do, I just want to acknowledge that someone asked me a question in general chat, and I still intend to answer it. I just keep forgetting, but I'll do that after. Go ahead, sir. Thank you.
So I had a question on the part of, if we have like these almost super beings like ruling our society and being very authoritarian, wouldn't most of our problems like be vanquished, and most of the pushes in society today are to alleviate problems. So I know that they're just a ruling force, but what would society do? Would it just be like a plain state following basic rules every day?
Well, thank you for your question. And actually, I had this discussion with Michael Aquinas on the server, and he said, well, yeah, his point was sort of that utopia would be a static thing and it would sort of reach an end state and stop. And wouldn't that be sort of bad or whatever, or self-defeating? But no, right? Because the optimal system, by definition, is not a static system. It's a dynamic, fluid, self-improving, reactive, responsive, and adaptive evolutionary and teleological system which works towards conscious ends, which are infinite, right? So humanity can easily expand to the solar system. We can easily expand to the stars if we don't destroy ourselves, which we will certainly do without a better government system, such as the one I'm proposing. So, you know, I mean, not certainly, we certainly might not all die, but the point is bad government will doom us all and truncate our future. But a meritocracy being a self-organizing, ever-enhancing thing, like, you know, life itself, it never reaches an end state, right? There's just because it's a utopia, it's a good society, doesn't mean there isn't better than good. So what's better than a Bugatti or a Lamborghini? Bugatti or a Lamborghini that constantly upgrades itself to the next year's model until eventually it's a flying car and then a spaceship. So utopia is not a fixed endpoint, it's an endless process, if that answers your question.
Is it okay if I respond? Yeah.
Yes, except if you don't mind, before I forget, because he actually asked the question quite a while ago, and I told him I would read it out. I guess he doesn't have a mic, but he asked how the system would prevent these people from being corrupted. Somebody else asked, wouldn't power corrupt? And maybe I should in that. Well, actually, you know what? I will let you respond. I've been hearing my own voice for too long. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so I heard what you guys said and how you responded. So you're right. You know, a lot of people can't govern themselves, and they do have to be governed. And I completely agree with that. There has to be a government. I'm not in any form an anarchist because I do realize that some people just aren't smart enough to function in society, and others are too smart for their own good and think that they can get away with anything. So I think libertarianism all is about education. If we went back to the classical way of educating people and did away with the fiat currency and the banks the way that things are going right now, I think that it might have a chance. But the way things are operating, I think that libertarianism is kind of out the window at this point. But that still doesn't, it's not going to stop me from governing myself and trying to spread the message of non-aggression principle and things like that go along with libertarianism. And I just, I don't know. I think it all boils down to our educational system and our money.
Yeah, I would like to hear Shogun respond to the other question. It wouldn't be fair for me to talk right now, so he might forget that.
Okay, thanks, Surprise. I'll read it really quickly. I want to read it exactly, not paraphrase it. So I just need to make sure I found it in the chat. I'm not sure if you don't have your mic, Kaiser, or maybe you're just shy. So, but nevertheless, it was a good question, and it looks like he asked you as one as well. Surprise, if you're following the sorry. And again, if anybody hasn't yet, please go to the recorded voice channel, which is called Rec Event, #Rec Event, and vote on the debate. But go ahead and respond, Surprise, while I find this text. Sorry.
Okay, well, I was actually typing up a response for him, but I would just say in the main that there's nothing wrong inherently with populism. Kaiser, it's just a matter of what the message is. I mean, if it's kill all Jews, then obviously not, but it's never that simple, at least for successful movements. There's nothing wrong with speaking to the concerns of the people and saying, yeah, I'm going to alleviate these. And I think we have to get away from a situation, which no one here has advocated to my knowledge, but we have to get away from an elitist situation where it's like, oh, well, you're not actually, it doesn't hurt that bad, or you're not that sad, or, it's not that big a deal. Look at, Steven Pinker arguments. Well, prosperity's risen in other countries. Therefore, your uncle being out of the job and addicted to opiates is perfectly okay. There's nothing wrong with populism. It's just a matter of how it's directed. And I would direct that to democracy in general. The people have to be channeled. There are all these incoherent, broad energies that are out there, and it's inherent upon leaders, frankly, like the Nazis did, although they did it for evil, like FDR did, like Teddy Roosevelt did, like Nixon did with the silent majority. There are energies out there. The point is, you have to channel them properly. And that way you get the feedback, you get the legitimacy of like, yeah, the majority are with. But yeah, populism by itself, appealing to the people, that's the whole point. There's nothing wrong with that. Be it social media, which you brought up, regular media, telling people what they want to hear can be an issue, but it's not an issue in and of itself. So long as you're laying down a marker and saying, this is where I am, follow me, yes or no.
Thank you, Surprise. And if I could now take the opportunity to answer this question. His question was, how will you ensure that these children do not succumb to the tendency of absolute power corrupts? How are you going to ensure that these slave kings won't give in to the notion of absolute power corrupts, because based on human irrationality, behavior is really uncertain. So again, I find that because people understand the benefits of intelligence, capability, and benevolence, therefore they tend to focus their criticisms of meritocracy or their fears about it or their uncertainty about it on the hypothetical possibility that these genius super kings or whatever slave kings could go rogue and turn against society, which is a very valid fear, right? Which is why that's such an important part of my system here. And I did address it during the podcast, but I'll do so, or the debate, but I'll do so again. So the sources of corruption are, like I said, nepotism, greed, and when I say nepotism, it doesn't just mean like loving your kids and wanting to hand on your kingdom. And again, there's been vast kingdoms ruled by great emperors who destroyed all of their progress because they gave their power to their children instead of the most capable, right? So obviously it should go from Augustus to, Julius Caesar to Alexander the Great to Genghis Khan. It shouldn't go from Genghis Khan to Genghis Khan's alcoholic son who dies right away. So that's a more obvious kind of nepotism. And I just wanted to say again, so it's bigger than that though, right? And so the best example of this, or another good example of this, is the cartels, right? So I think a lot about cartels, and I don't like to do it, but anyways, the point is Mexico is a failed state now. It's been taken over by the cartels. And this is actually a literal fact. They won't tell you this in the news, but the Mexican government doesn't exist anymore. It's now the cartel government. And what that means is that the government is whoever has the monopoly on violence, right? By ipso facto, might makes right, not morally, but in practice, the strongest will prevail. So as soon as the state is met in actual open combat and defeated, and is not able to retaliate immediately and overwhelmingly, then they're no longer the state, and whoever defeated them is now the state. Now, that means that the cartel is now the state, because if you didn't know, Mexican military arrested a cartel lord's son. They had a fight, and the overwhelming military power brought to bear by the cartels caused the Mexican military to stand down and release a very important criminal, which means there is no rule of law in Mexico, and the cartels are now the law, right? This is an obvious fact. Well, how did this happen? It's because the cartels do three things. They call it silver or lead, right? Which means you either take enormous bribes and become enormously wealthy, which is greed, or you get the lead, which will kill you. The problem is many people are willing to die, but very few people are willing to see their daughters dissolved in acid in front of their eyes bit by bit, or watch their wife be skinned alive. I, for example, would not be willing to face this kind of consequence. Therefore, I could never actually engage the cartels in any way, because they would kill my family in front of me and then kill me very slowly. So there's only one group of people that could potentially take on this kind of evil, right? This kind of systematic, limitless evil. And that would be a group that has no parents, has no children, has no wives, has no name, has no bank account, and is born and raised for the purpose of service to the state, ergo slave kings, who cannot be corrupted by fear, by nepotism, or by the kidnapping and extortion of their families. And also 24/7 surveillance, no privacy, constant surveillance by a team of experts who monitor mental health, behavior, logic, ethics, etc. So they're watched 24/7 by a panel of expert psychologists, sociologists, behavioral experts. So the whole point of the system is to make corruption completely impossible.
Is it not true that your family is those you essentially grow up with? Would they not see each other as that effect, or are they also being raised in complete isolation?
No, they would. That's a good question. Again, they would be in interaction with each other, and they would also be very engaged with external society, because in order to understand the population and so forth, they'd have to have many like practicums and placements, and probably covertly be placed in normal life to observe it and understand it and study it and so forth.
So
Which is a
how would
tangent. No, hold on, sorry, I haven't quite answered your question. The point is, they would be permitted to have sexual relationships. They would not be permitted to have long-term romantic relationships except with one another. The reason that this would be safe is because, again, these children would be, like I said, F-35 humans. So again, if these children are being kidnapped, the government has already failed, because these would be like Pentagon level security. So if any of these kids were ever kidnapped or tortured or anything like that, it would mean the government's already, that'd be like the president getting kidnapped or the king. So that's not going to happen. The security would be mind-boggling, right?
Okay.
The point is they would live in a specific fortified, top secret, possibly deep underground military complex, right?
I'd love to get in here, but Shogun, you had a question from Motivated King. You wanted to.
Thank you, sir, but it's your turn by all means.
Well, honestly, I only have general points to make. So let's, if you would tackle that question. You need time to read it.
That's sure thing. Thank you. Could you expand on the upbringing of the children without their parents in your utopia, if it's important to your case and if there's time? Yeah, absolutely. So the upbringing of the children without their parents. Well, they wouldn't need to be separated from their parents at birth, and it would be enormously harmful for that to happen, right? So they would be breastfed, they would be cuddled, they'd be sang to, they'd be read to by their parents, as would be beneficial for their neurodevelopment, right, which is so important. So they would have not a deprived environment, but a highly enriched environment, the whole system being optimized for their well-being, right? I'm not an expert in early childhood development, my mother is, so I guess I know more about it than most, but the early period of development is by far the most significant, exponentially decreasing over time, which is a tie into another event, which is why circumcision is insanely harmful. But we're going to hear a debate about that, so I don't want to weigh in on that right now. But the point is, your brain is like a little sponge when you're a baby, and if you're like nurtured and cared for in infancy, that's hugely important. And if not, it's hugely detrimental. And trauma in infancy is the worst thing, or trauma in childhood and so forth. So these children would not be traumatized, right? Their system would be providing all their emotional needs, psychological needs, to a degree that really no one else in human history would ever have experienced. However, they would also be under relentless pressure, right? Because let's be honest, competition, testing, success and failure, rising and falling in hierarchies, washing out, failing in your task, and competing against the best, right? This is like being a UFC champion, basically. It's amazing, but it's stressful, right? Not that I am one, obviously. But yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but the point is, I'm not an expert, but experts would determine how they're raised. So if it's best for them to, be raised by a group of different nurses who have long-term positive relationships with them, or to have, a series of different wet nurses. But the point is, right, I didn't say this before, and I'll get off the mic right away. I call this the Ender's Game system of government. And so if you haven't read Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, probably maybe my favorite book, actually. And what it describes, very quickly, is a situation where Earth is attacked by intelligent insects in spaceships, alien insects, that are much more intelligent and technologically advanced than humans. And so they obviously are wiping us out. And the only way that we can respond is to search the Earth for extreme outliers and just say, well, they're smarter than us, so we can't beat them. The only way to succeed, therefore, is to become smarter. And so they put all these kids in what's called battle school, which is actually in an orbital space station. And it's exactly what I'm describing, right? It's a bunch of super geniuses locked in like an endless competition, testing, and surveillance system. If you want to understand my system, just read Ender's Game. It's all there. I guess maybe in a sense I took it from that. But my thinking about this also is our version of that could be aliens. It could also be ecological collapse. It could also be social collapse. It could also be pandemic plague. It could also be artificial intelligence. All of these systems of complex problems are too complicated for ordinary humans. We need to create more intelligent humans to handle problems of this complexity. Thanks. Is there any other questions or comments or anything?
I just wanted to say there's a book by the title of Red Rising. Although it does not have the being raised to be benevolent kings aspect, it has a sort of a decent view on how the society you're proposing could collapse through infiltration from the lower ranks of it. An individual pretending to be of the class of people who, through corruption of the lower levels, someone is put in a position where you can get someone who's not raised like those kids are in their position and take everything down from the inside. It's
interesting.
yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. Maybe I'll check that out sometime. I'm not sure if I quite understand the concept, and I can't see how that would be possible in the system that I'm describing.
It
But
wouldn't quite be.
I'll just clarify quickly what I was wanting to say. Yeah, sorry. Right. So the point is, yeah, of course, any system could potentially fail, right? However, the fact that a certain system could potentially fail doesn't mean it couldn't also potentially succeed. You see what I'm saying? So you can absolutely postulate situations in which this system would fail. I just think that it minimizes those situations exponentially vis-a-vis any other system ever created. So it's like, is it a perfect system? No. The purpose of it is simply that it's the best possible system, right? Meritocracy, by definition, is the best possible system, because how could there be? And what I mean by this is we can only create a system as good as the people who create that system. Therefore, the best system will be created by the best people. That's kind of my A=A reasoning of this.
Makes perfect sense to me. A perfect system has to be, by its nature, inflexible, because it would have to be perfect given its current circumstances, and reality changes over time. So, of course.
Right, and that reminds me of something Sir Price said earlier that I wanted to respond to and forgot to. He said, a government is an art, not a science, and I couldn't agree more. I am an artistic person more than a scientific person, and I am also a martial artist, right? And so when you're fighting, it's not a science, it's an art. Because there isn't actually a perfect way to fight, or if there is, we'll never know what it is, right? There's only the best way to fight we've found yet, which is called the UFC champion, right? So that's an example of a meritocracy. Who is the UFC champion? The best fighter on earth. Who's the best fighter on earth? The UFC champion. Apply that same logic to the president of the United States. How can you go wrong? I mean, look at how Putin has just outfoxed Trump at every stage, right? Because look at the outcomes these produce. You have democracy, right? An endless repeating system of short-term lobbying, campaigning, left versus right, bipartisan politics, and voting. You get Donald Trump. In Russia, you have the fall of the KGB, the rise of a KGB spy, or sorry, the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of a KGB spy chief into a king who then rules for 35 years and makes a series of extremely well-informed decisions and good policies, right? Brings the alcoholism rate way down, brings the GDP way up, brings the debt rate way down, makes huge international gains, et cetera, et cetera. And look at America, you got race riots, you got, pandemic, et cetera. I mean, pandemics everywhere. But the point is, Vladimir Putin is an example of a meritocratic politician, right? Whether he did it ethically or not, he certainly rose to the top because he earned that by outcompeting all his rivals who easily would have killed him and tortured him, et cetera, if they could have. But at the end of the day, he ended up on top and he made himself president for life, right? And that's essentially how this system that I'm describing, it can only come about two ways. It's not, nobody's ever going to vote my system into being, no matter how articulately I make it. So I actually envision the system coming about through essentially a coup, right? And I'm not advocating for anything illegal. This is a complete thought experiment. Please do not act in any way that contradicts any laws. I'm just saying, if such a system were to come about, it would probably be through some kind of benevolent coup by probably a military general or something who shared a vision similar to this and simply used force to achieve it. It's the only way it's going to happen.
By that same logic, does Xi Jinping achieved his position in the same way?
Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, they all did.
I know it sounds like I'm being quiet, but I have the majority position, so it is important that Shogun gets his message out with regards to authoritarianism.
No, it's totally fine. I've had lots of time. We all have. So now it's just open mic. It's circulating. Take the mic as often as you want and say anytime you want, but there's no pressure either because I can continue talking and we can also wrap this up at any time. But it's certainly been a great event and debate, at least from my point of view. Super enjoyable and helped me clarify my thoughts. I'm curious, is there anyone here who would be comfortable saying they think this is just totally crazy or unethical or evil or stupid? Like, does anyone think what I've described is just beyond the pale? Because I realize what I've described is, it's what you call eugenics. I'm describing, a coup and people who never know their families and they're genetically engineered. And I understand that from a certain point of view, this is freaking ghoulish, right? But the reason is, it's the concept of the necessary evil and the greater good. Right? So it's not that these aren't evil things that are being done to these children, depriving them of their family. It is absolutely evil. Unfortunately, it's a necessary evil for a greater good. But I'm just wondering, is there anyone who thinks this is just like mad scientist level evil crazy?
Well, I don't think it's evil or crazy. I just think that it's unsustainable. I think you can get a generation of super administrators, but over time, I mean, the criteria matters. I mean, what is the right economic policy? What is the right foreign policy? All of that matters, and IQ is not going to help you there. I mean, one of the smartest people I know in high school, we had great conversations. We still Facebook from time to time. It's the only time I use Facebook. Was a Marxist. I mean, we're diametrically opposed, but his IQ is at least as high as mine. His morality is probably higher than, to be honest, given what I've done versus what he's done. So it's just, I don't see it sustainable because it's all about, you can have genetically engineered super soldiers, but it's all about how they're trained to fight. I could genetically engineer great counterinsurgency Marines, but what happens when we go to war with China? So, I mean, to me, it's kind of like I'm an American, so I'm biased. But to me, it just seems like what we have now, where you have a meritocracy, but what constitutes a merit degrades over time to where, yeah, I mean, Mr. Smith was great, but his dipshit son was an idiot, and his fucking half-wit grandson is an even worse idiot, and he bought securitized mortgages and fucking wrecked the economy. So for me, it's like, I mean, it's great in theory, but in the long term, I won't say I don't see it working because we're doing mind experiments here. No one's obligated to prove an example or anything, but I don't see how it works.
Yeah, all relatively fair, but if I can just clarify something, I think you were just using it in an analogy way, but my system is not hereditary, right? So these children would not pass power on to their children. They would either not have children. Actually, they almost certainly would have a lot of children. The government would probably be having them have sex with a different woman every day in order to maximize their offspring, given their inherent superiority. So they'd have lots of sex, they'd have tons of children, but they wouldn't ever know their children. And so the only way their children would end up in power would be the exact same way they did, right? Through objective meritocratic competition and testing. But just to get back to the point, I want to concede, I would offer democracy in this system, but it would be essentially a retroactive democracy. The thinking is, yeah, the medicine tastes bitter when it's going down, but it feels nice when the disease goes away. And if you got a child, you're trying to give them cough syrup, they don't want it. And they're obviously going to vote against the cough syrup as soon as they taste it. However, if it's a legitimate medicine, they need to take it whether it tastes good or not. However, presumably, if you're not being malevolent, dishonest, or incompetent, they would then understand why you did it as they started to feel better, right? There's a story about this guy, he's chasing this guy around trying to hit him, and I guess they don't speak the same language, or the guy thinks he's trying to hit him, and actually the guy's trying to kill a snake that he sees is about to bite the guy that's like on him, or a spider. But the guy keeps running away because he misinterprets the person trying to save him as the person trying to hurt him, right? So that's why you can't have democracy on the front end. What you can have is never-ending direct democracy, right? People could actually be voting on every issue directly. So In my system, everyone would have a citizenship card. Not only would you get a vote, actually, I'm just developing this in my mind as I go, based on what you said, but you would actually get a vote on every single issue, right? So they would know exactly what your opinion was. You get one vote on every single issue of policy, but they're not obligated to listen to the majority, but they'd be constantly getting that feedback. And obviously no intelligent administrator would ignore such feedback without very good reasons. And so in my system, I'd even grant you a 10 or 20 year period and say, listen, we're seizing power and we're going to do whatever we think is best for 10 or 20 years. Then we're going to have a legitimate, fair, open, democratic vote. And if you genuinely don't see the benefits of it by now, then it's obviously not working. But in my vision, the economy would thrive, the environment would thrive, you know, every measure of health and wellness and happiness and mental well-being would thrive, suicide would go down, crime would go down. And so nobody in their right mind would vote against it, but they need to see it work before they'll see that and trust you. So you can't do it with their trust. You have to earn their trust after you take power.
All right, so I'm finally back home. So I guess the only question, Shogun, is how would you carry out this coup? Would it be through the military? And if people wouldn't vote it in, how would you convince whoever is going to do the coup to carry it out?
It's a great question, and I'm really happy you're here, and I hope we can talk because I was hoping you would, you know, obviously have thoughts on this. I'm going to be honest, I feel like it might be unwise for me to answer that question. That might be information that's not really responsible or ethical for me to divulge because you're asking me how someone might or could be convinced to take over, et cetera. So this would border on advocating for illegal violence or political violence, which I just realized I've already done. So nevertheless, like I said, thought experiment, do not do anything illegal. I'm not advocating violence. I'm imagining a scenario that could play out that I believe would be beneficial, but which I am not advocating or requesting anybody to do under any circumstances. Please obey your government.
I have a question. My question is, and totally hypothetical, but let's say that this world was in a different universe, not ours. Would in that universe, would this system be instilled in today's world?
Sorry, can you repeat your question, please? And I'm sorry I didn't mean to brush off your question, Dawson. It seems like a legally gray area for me to describe how a government could be taken down, because if I'm correct, that information would obviously be very harmful. I hope you understand.
And I was going to get in the conversation earlier, but I was in the grocery store and walking around, so it wasn't the best opportunity for me.
I understand, no problem. I'm just saying I'm glad you're here, and I hope you don't misunderstand me refusing to answer your first question.
The question that I had was, hypothetically, would this system that you had be put in today's world, or even more specifically in a country like America?
Well, yeah, I mean, so again, this is a thought experiment, this is a simulation, this is a video game, this is a Minecraft, okay? But if you had a very intelligent, meritocratic, capable, and competent general who decided to do a coup, right? I'm not advocating this, and I'm not inventing the idea of coups. They've happened all through history, right? So this is when the military enacts a junta or whatever you call a coup, like a martial law, they take over, right? Then democracy is suspended and you're under martial law. So I believe that the advent of a meritocratic democracy would be something along the lines of a junta or martial law. Maybe this is an appropriate answer to your question, Dawson, as well. So if I'm correct, if this was genuinely benevolent and this person was genuinely more competent than the existing leaders, you would then expect a period of sustained positive growth in all different ways. And therefore, if the system was successful, it would continue to expand. Everyone would benefit within that system. It would then either be simulated, adopted, or adapted by other countries voluntarily, just seeing how well it works, or presumably the government may actually expand in some other way, right? And it may, if my system is correct, end up actually becoming a global system over time through a combination of diplomacy, trade, cultural hegemony, etc., as well as military dominance, such as the US government has already. Then it could, if my system works as I imagine it would, we would pretty quickly put bases on the moon. We would then go from the moon to Mars. We'd colonize the moons of Saturn and Jupiter. We'd put bases in the asteroid belt and so on and so forth until, like the galactic empire of man in the Dune series, or the galactic empire of man in the Warhammer 40,000 mythos, we would become a galactic species. I mean, there is no ceiling on what humans could do under the right leadership. By making the right decisions and making the wrong decisions, we could live forever. We could have faster than light travel. We could have no more war, no more disease. So yeah, this what I'm saying is my actual opinions. This isn't like a fairy tale. This is my take on the real world.
So in response to that response, I would say that totally that is completely unethical. Just the system itself, first of all, and the instillment of the system, but the putting it in action. I mean, we have put totally unethical dilemmas to be like fully supported by governmental backed recessions. So for instance, what I mean is like the collapse of the economy in 2008, totally a government problem, but I mean to the point of the need of the recession. And then through the government there were so many pro people, and the well-being of the people, that we put so much money into the people and then ended up having one of the worst recessions. What I'm saying is, it's so the instillment of the uh, the government would be just met by like so many problem-esque fights in all over the world, and the problem would be the system itself. Don't you see that?
Well, you're absolutely right. And I want to clarify something. I'm not saying a military coup or junta would be the ideal or optimal way for my system to come about. The ideal or optimal way for my system to come about would be through a democratic process where everyone was convinced through rational argumentation and so forth that this was the best system and could all be convinced to vote for it, or some variation of it that could then evolve into its complete form over time. So please don't, I realize I was misleading with my last comment. What I was saying is that's just the most conceptually plausible way the system could come about, right? Is just simply seize power, make everything better, let people see the benefits, and then they'll actually understand and consent. But in the real world, obviously you never want to use force, you never want to use violence, right? That's not what I'm advocating. I'm just saying that's the most likely way it could come about. And I'm not saying that should happen necessarily in the United States or anything like that. But you can easily imagine a country where that would actually be a good outcome, right? So you actually use the example of like bank bailouts or something. So this is hypothetical. Let's say you have a country called, I don't know, Shogunistan, right? And all of a sudden the government becomes super corrupt and starts giving hundreds of billions of dollars of bank bailouts while people are starving in the streets and don't have any health care. And then someone says, you know what, fuck this. And, actually takes that hundreds of billions of dollars that went to, Rockefeller, Goldman Sachs, or Bear Stearns and gave it to the actual citizens of the country in need. That would then objectively be a benevolent act, right? So as an example of what I'm saying that might be more morally comprehensible, consider the character of Robin Hood, right? He was robbing from rich robbers who are exploiting the people and oppressing them and so forth, and then giving the money to the people in need, and therefore was a hero. So that would be how I would morally defend at least the concept, right? And even beyond something like bank bailouts, a better example would have been, imagine the government actually becomes evil itself, right? So we've had many examples of it, like, for example, Stalinism, or, Hitler and Nazism. So if the government starts doing genocide or democide, which just means indiscriminate people killing of the citizens regardless of race, then obviously a coup would be completely ethical and justified, and then you'd call it a revolution, right? And of course, we remember that's actually how America was created, essentially, right? Through a rebellion. So what I'm advocating here, although I agree that it's not optimal and it's not ideal, is actually how America was created in the first place.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'd love to respond, but if somebody else wants to say something.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, so much of our market today throughout all countries, and especially with America, is just based on problems that arise in like everyday life. So, I mean, even if it's a vote, like, even if it's going through a vote, what you're asking is to just put total economies on hold for the instillment of like a well-being. And that well-being.
How are the economies being put on hold? Or rather, if I could just answer, all I'm advocating for is the adaptation and improvement of a faulty, flawed, and inefficient system into an optimized and very efficient system, right? That's all I'm advocating for. But now I've been asked to consider how it could actually practically be brought about, right? And so the point is, no economy in the system need be put on hold, right? This transition need not be disruptive or harmful, right? However, it's quite likely that the ordinary person would not understand the benefits of it, right? So I do understand that they might take time, right? You could imagine a totally different scenario, which I probably should have given you before the junta one. I'll tell you why I gave you the coup reason, or why you might consider why that might be so unethical. But obviously another possibility would be the gradual cultivation and implementation of this in a boiling frog kind of method, which would be, you slowly turn up the water, you slowly move society in this way. Boiling frog is a bad analogy because that's a bad thing. But my point is you could create this change gradually through social engineering that was completely nonviolent and just based on basic things like propaganda, ideology, advertising, education, social engineering, right? You could just socially engineer this over time. The reason that may not be possible, though, is if you were facing an existential threat, right? If there was actually a threat so grave that there was not time for such a process, right? And you could give examples of this, right? Like normally, if I'm saying, oh shit, we're in the Titanic, we're about to hit an iceberg, and I'm sitting there trying to convince everybody we need to go to the lifeboats, right? Maybe my family doesn't believe me, they think I've gone crazy. But if I'm not crazy, I'm morally obligated to, force them onto that lifeboat, and they'll understand why when the Titanic goes down, if you see what I'm saying.
I fully understand, and my point was more of a response to the whether or not or whether or not I see it as an ethical dilemma or not. What I'm saying overall is I think that your system would work, but definitely not in today's society. It would have to be in like a simulation, of course, but even over that, like on a whole different planet where nothing has ever been experimented on, period. But to the point that I was making is it's the same that instilling this like system would be the same problem as like per se a 2008 bailout. It would be disrupting economies, and the reason that I said that at all was because, like I was bringing up, most of our economy is in response to like problems that we're having, and you're talking about alleviating problems through like these total overhead systems that are just alleviating problems. And even today, like whenever we have problems, most money is going towards like alleviating that problem. But what you're suggesting is there would never ever be a problem because like I mean, I'm just gonna assume that you know what I mean.
Well, I think I'm kind of sort of do, because I had a similar conversation with someone else before, but I don't understand why people seem to make this confusion, so to speak. No disrespect intended, but I'm certainly not suggesting there would be no problems. The whole reason for the system is there's always going to be existential problems. You cannot escape it. We're always in danger of destruction. We're always in danger of death. Personally, society, civilization can collapse at any time, any day. Society can collapse at any time. We get hit by an asteroid, the sun can go supernova, new pandemic plague can break out, someone get detonated dirty nuke, God forbid, terrorist attack, cyber attack, et cetera, right? And then all the way out into space, black holes are just careening through space at billions of miles an hour, and they could eat up the planet at any time. Rogue planets exist. So we are a long way from being out of the woods, my friends. That's why we need this system, so that we can solve the never-ending possible existential threats that we face. And if I could just point out to you what you said about, people also point out the inherent difficulties of transitioning from one system to another system, right? And that's kind of absolutely true, right? So every society in history if it had a radical change like the one I'm describing, that would require a radical method to achieve it in most cases, right? And if anyone isn't aware, it's interesting to note that radical means going to the root, right? And I would argue that that's the idea here. You go to the root of the problem. Why have we not achieved utopia in thousands of years? Why do we have this much technology and these bad of outcomes? Why do we have the most educated, intelligent, interconnected people in the world, and yet we're still not coming up with adequate solutions to basic problems like poverty, homelessness, et cetera? Things are getting worse, not better, in many ways. That should not be happening. So obviously the system is diseased. When the system is diseased, you have to get to the root of the issue, which is the way we select our leaders and the way we govern our societies. It needs to change. There's inherent difficulties in that change, but those difficulties should not daunt us because of their necessity.
So Shogun, another question that comes to mind is, have you seen the movie Gattaca?
I'm sorry to say that I haven't, but I'd love you to tell me the concept of it.
So it's analogous to the situation that you're wanting to implement. Long story short, it's set in the far future where, in order to go on space missions, you have to have a certain genetic code. You have to be raised in a certain way with genetic engineering. And the idea of the movie is that someone breaks into the system and is able to fool all of the security systems in check, even though this individual has almost the worst genes on the planet. And so really the question is, how do you stop the society from becoming totalitarian, and B, aren't you worried that this is sort of a pipe dream, that there's always going to be tricksters and pranksters who want to get in, or people who just genuinely want to make a difference in their country, and they see cheating and lying as the only way to get through the strict protocols?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it is the core risk of my system, right? So it's like nuclear weapons. Well, I mean, that's not a very flattering comparison, but their fundamental risk is their misuse or their misappropriation by rogue actors, etc. However, their power may be necessary, right? So the point is, how do we prevent this? Well, the other thing, people keep asking, like, what if these guys go bad? What if they're evil? What if they're a sociopath? The thing about that is that, of course, that's true, but that's true of our existing society. There's already people with their fingers on the nuclear trigger. There's already people controlling aircraft carrier battle groups and fucking armies and special forces and black operations and CIA. So the current system is already, given us the worst possible examples, like MK Ultra, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, et cetera. All of this came about under what we're calling democracy. Secret torture experiments on civilians, et cetera. Right. So the point is, my system is not different in that if the people go bad, then that would be a problem. It's only different in that the system is fundamentally designed to make that infinitely less likely. Right. So I already described the safeguards, which are actually the most restrictive I'm aware of ever existing on politicians. So, people always like, well, what if they go rogue? But the whole point is they're slave kings. They live in a government facility. They're under 24/7 surveillance. They have no families. Every single word they ever say is listened to by a panel of people who are experts who've been watching them since birth. And those people are trained in identifying sociopaths, narcissistic personality traits, sadism, cruelty, maliciousness. I mean, you would be talking about like very highly trained people, trained specifically in forensics and forensic pathology, looking for the tiniest hint, right? People who are trained all their lives dealing with con men and murderers and serial killers and sociopaths, right? So the point isn't that corruption or rogue agents would be impossible. It's that it would be infinitely less likely than any other system.
So I need to clarify, because my fear isn't that in your system there's going to be rogue agents. Mine is a more bureaucratic fear, as Sir Price is probably well aware in the military, and that there's an idea of mission creep. So what I'm worried about is if controllers of this program say, well, this works well here, why don't we introduce a tiny bit of that into the society writ large, and then eventually that snowballs into that the plan is now nationwide rather than only on a specific group of people. And it's not that anyone goes rogue. It's just that through mission creep and just the inertia of bureaucracy, ambitious people decide to try to in their minds improve society by incrementally introducing elements of the program into the general public.
Well, if I can answer that, ideally that's exactly what would happen, right? So as I said earlier, the concept here is a vanguard or tip of the spear concept. So the idea is we kind of leapfrog gradualism and gradual progress by creating in one generation or two or three, whatever is the minimum necessary, like superhumans, right? Not just cognitively and so forth, but also ethically. So they're not just philosopher kings, they're philosopher saint kings, right? You're talking about Jesus Christ crossed with Marcus Aurelius and Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan and Nikola Tesla, right? All together, ideally, to whatever extent that is possible, right? Granted, that may not be even remotely possible, but that would be the idea. And so then you would then kind of create a new form of humanity that's just superior in every way. And then their exact purpose would be what you're describing as potential negative. It would precisely be to change society to be better overall. But how that would take place, I'm agnostic about, because again, in my system, it's not that I feel like I know how to organize society. I just believe that I know how to organize a system that will identify the people who can organize society. Whatever they say, whether it's democracy, anarchy, communism, I'll listen to them. But I just want that system to be created so that we can actually find out how we should be ordering society from people who are competent to make that decision, granted that the existing systems are objectively failing.
But I mean, tugging on the string a little bit, if eventually everyone becomes a superhuman, don't we then go back to a democracy stage where everyone is equal again, and we run through this rigmarole again and again, so it just becomes huge cycles?
Well, no, ideally it would only happen once, right? And that goes back to Hank Hill's earlier point. So the point of this is the control and force and so forth applied by the government ideally would be approaching zero, because the whole reason they have authority is because of their superiority. But because they're also chosen for benevolence, their goal is to elevate everyone else up as well, which means they will become less and less necessary, and their power can be exerted more and more gently and subtly, to the point that an optimal society, like Taoism describes, would be like a perfect efficiency, like an over-unity device, right? Like a free energy society that just effortlessly accomplished everything. And actually Lao Tzu says, strive to do less and less every day until by doing nothing you accomplish everything, right? So that was kind of be the idea. We take all these people, and this is actually something Dr. Weird talks about as well. Only difference is in my system, this happens through benevolent paternalistic government, and in his system, he believes in real Mad Max shit, but that's for another day. But the point is, the whole point would be like, you need a good shepherd. And again, the shepherd analogy is kind of weird because sometimes sheep get eaten, but assuming sheep didn't get eaten, right, the shepherd is there to look out and take care of them, like Christ or whatever. And so ideally, the relationship of these people towards their citizens would be something like, Christ's love for us. And as you guys know, I'm a Christian. So what I'm saying is these people wouldn't just be the most noble and benevolent people ideally ever. They would hopefully be as or more benevolent as characters like Buddha or Jesus. But in my system, given that I'm not a pacifist like Buddha or Jesus, or at least portrayed to be, I don't believe Jesus was a pacifist. Nevertheless, I'm, as you know, more martially minded. And so my ideal system would be, Christ as warrior, as king. Only because war is necessary, and only for as long as it is. Does that answer your question, or did I completely misunderstand your point?
That's a good answer.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, because the idea is, right, like, this is the most simple analogy. The server is a good analogy because it's more large and has many ways it's a good analogy, but a family is a more simple analogy. It's also very importantly valid, right? So when your child is a baby, you literally do things to them that would be totally illegal otherwise, like take their pants off, change their diapers, and so forth, because that's what needs to be done. And the baby actually objectively doesn't consent to this, right? They scream, they cry, they hate getting their diapers changed, but everyone knows you have to do it, whether they like it or not. As they get older, they get potty trained. Obviously, you don't keep changing their diapers and all that. They don't need diapers anymore. And then when they get older, they get the keys to the car and they don't have curfew. The curfew gets later and later. And pretty soon they're living on their own and they don't need you at all. That's sort of my model here. This is just a way to take a fucked up system and fix it. And then if government is totally successful, it could just dissolve. Like I said earlier, my ideal system would be anarchy in a perfect world. But in the real world, it's the worst system. But my system would be designed to create the perfect world, and then we could revert to anarchy, right? By which I mean like a paradisical primal state of equality and freedom. But the point is, the current system is designed precisely to destroy that, right? So therefore, a new system is required to restore it. Well, guys, this has been a really good event, a really fairly long event, and I actually have to get up for work in a couple hours. So we can continue for a little bit longer, but we should be winding down soon. Does anyone have any more comments they wanted to make?
I think that's a good place to wrap it up at.
All right, well, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, not on my end.
You sure you don't want to make any closing statements, Surprise, or anybody else?
No, we need to do this again. My main thing with this was just teasing out your own views, which have come up, but they're not. I feel like they're a lot clearer to everyone here now.
Yeah, and hopefully that's a good thing and not a bad thing, but you'll have to decide that for yourself. It's
think it's a
also
good
helps.
thing.
Yeah, well, and it helps me also a lot to clarify my thinking, to test it, to hear people's criticisms of it, and to consider the implications and so forth. So even in this conversation, right, there's been several ways in which my model has changed significantly, such as incorporating retroactive democracy after consent can be based on a period of demonstration. Micro democracy, direct democracy for every single social policy, but not binding. It would be like we all get a suggestion, but at the end of the day, it's up to the experts what we're going to do. But presumably, this would be valid social information that would be acted on whenever reasonable, et cetera, right? So if a lot of people want, more water parks, there's no reason that a benevolent government wouldn't make more water parks. And if they say, hey, what we really want is more healthcare, then obviously the government would say, oh, the people want more healthcare. So democracy, therefore, would actually, in my system, I'm now realizing, be inherent to every single decision. The only reason it's different, though, is that democracy would not bind the hands of leaders. It would only inform their decisions. So that being said, thank you very much, Surprise, for the debate. I'd love to talk about this again in different ways with anybody, anytime. Debate anybody about it, or just do more open discussions. We've done a series about, how would you govern society if you had a choice? So go back and listen to those episodes. And me and Mr. Dawson did one about political systems once, so you can find those on RT podcasts if you're into this kind of thing. But I see it as being like a recurring thing because obviously as a trained as a social scientist, not professionally. This is like the most interesting thing to me, right? It's what is the optimal form of social organization? What is the optimal system of social engineering? What is the most benevolent application of social engineering? How can we save the world through social engineering, et cetera? So, because I hate to tell you guys, as it is, I mean, we probably got 30 to 50 years before an existential crisis, the likes of which our minds cannot fathom. And that would be extremely on the generous end. And the current administration is not even remotely equipped even for their current challenges, which are about to amplify exponentially, right? So as catastrophic runaway climate change, et cetera, amplifies to like passing every single identified ecological tipping point, I mean, look at the government right now. There's riots in the streets. There's, huge economic problems. There's, medical problems, every kind of problem. And yet everything's about to get worse. So I don't see how the government can survive. Which is, why I just said what I said earlier. I'd also really appreciate if anyone can tell me their opinion on whether I said anything in this episode that could potentially be dangerous to the server or legally, because obviously that should then be edited out. Did anything I say possibly construe in the wrong way?
No. It was very clear.
No, I think you did great. I mean, this was a good discussion. And to be honest, I'm not going to say I didn't come prepared to defend democracy. I did. And I feel like I presented my positions fairly competently, but I kind of wanted to tease out your position. You did so. And yeah, it was fine. You didn't sound like a Nazi or anything.
Well, thank you. And not only did you make your position well, you essentially convinced me of your point, right? Because I was here arguing authoritarianism. And, I now realize that my system is not incompatible with radical democracy at the same time, right? So you could actually be infinitely more democratic than we currently are under an authoritarian meritocracy, because the authoritarian meritocracy could just unilaterally decide to give everybody votes on everything that they currently have no votes on, right? So the current thing is like first past the post, bipartisan constituency policy or whatever. I may be getting some of these terms wrong, but you get what I mean. The current form of democracy is nowhere near the most democratic imaginable, or the most responsive, or the most transparent, or the most whatever. So my benevolent administrators could easily just decide to create, much better democracy. The only limit I put on it, though, is, there's this existential level, right? So if you have one guy whose IQ is like 790, and nobody else can understand that he knows that if you guys all do this certain thing, it's going to open a black hole and swallow the whole planet. If he's 100% sure that that's the case, and he's not mentally ill, and he's a genius, then he has every right to unilaterally hijack the whole planet to prevent that outcome, right? So,
you guys are one argument for democracy.
You can think about that. That being said, thank you, everybody. We'll wrap this up now. So again, we're the Roundtable Discord server. Just Google Roundtable Discord. Find us on YouTube. Find us on social media, in the RT Podcast channel, and on YouTube is where all podcasts are posted. Thank you so much, everybody. Good night. See you tomorrow. Lots of good events coming up.